As part of the 2012 budget deal, the legislature and the governor agreed to find $6 billion in new revenue by the end of the year, or cut the budget by that amount. If the voters do not pass Governor Brown's Proposition 30, almost 90% of those cuts, or about $5.4 billion, will be cut from education starting in January. That is the equivalent of cutting 3 weeks off the school year. The majority of Prop 30's tax hike would be aimed at those making $250,000 or more. An alternative proposition, Prop 38, being championed by wealthy civil rights lawyer Molly Munger, would raise more money for education, but would not address the $6 billion state budget shortfall, since it would give most of the money raised directly to school districts. We'll be speaking with the key players behind these education propositions. Dean Vogel, the president of the California Teachers Association, a powerful force in state politics that represents 325,000 members, including K-12 teachers who work in over 1,000 school districts. John Kabateck, California Executive Director of the National Federation of Independent Business, an association representing small and independent businesses. Carol Kocivar, President of the California State PTA, an organization that has nearly 1 million members volunteering on behalf of public schools, children, and families. And Allan Zaremberg, President and CEO of the California Chamber of Commerce, an organization with over 13,000 members who employ 1/4 of the private sector workforce in California. And we'll have a guest commentary by the Dean of the Capitol Press Corps, George Skelton of the LA Times. Props 30 and 38. Dueling props or dueling props?
From Fresno, the Maddy Report, with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Kepler.
Welcome. Improving K-12 education is a top priority for Governor Brown, and he's hoping that voters will pass Proposition 30 to forestall a possible $5.4 billion hit to education. One key supporter of Prop 30 is the California Teachers Association. Its president, Dean Vogel, is our guest. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Well, happy to be here. Thanks.
Well, you know, those opposed to Prop 30 want it to be a referendum on state government and whether it can be trusted with our tax dollars. Why do you think voters would approve any tax increase, even one that mainly targets those over $250,000 and is primarily for education?
Well, I'll tell you, the voters in California have been consistently saying that they believe in public education and they believe that public education needs the resources necessary to get the work done. And, you know, the accountability that's built into this proposition is really going to appeal to the voter because the money goes into a special fund. Legislators can't really touch it. There are annual audits built into the initiative that are going to guarantee that the money is spent in the appropriate way. And if anybody tries to mess with that process, they're going to jail.
That sounds pretty serious. Let me ask you another question, though. When you're saying passage of Prop 30, one of the things that they're focusing on is placing additional burdens, quote unquote, on the highest earners. And some people say that's not fair. What's your response to that? Well,
you know, it's about time that the highest earners start paying their fair share. I mean, think about it. Even with this initiative passing, even with the added tax burden, the burden for the highest earners is still going to be less than it was when Pete Wilson was governor.
But the counter argument would be, well, listen, the 1% of California's income tax filers pay 40% of the state's personal income taxes. Is that fair?
Well, think about, I like to go right to the Buffett rule. Does it make sense that somebody's secretary should be paying a higher percentage of tax than the CEO that is hiring her? I mean, really, it's about fairness. And we're not asking the highest earners. I mean, really, if you're making less than $250,000 a year, this doesn't even impact you, except for the sales tax piece of it, which is only 4 years, and it's only a quarter of a penny.
Quarter of a cent?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me ask you another question. They say if you focus on high income earners, they base a lot of their money on their investments. And those investments are subject to the stock market, so the ups and downs of the stock market, so therefore state revenue is going to be even more volatile. What do you say to that?
Well, you know, that's true. I mean, this is a highly volatile situation, but think about it. It's been highly volatile for a long time, and public education has taken huge hits, over $20 billion. That's why this is a short-term solution. I mean, on the long term, what we've got to do is we've got to be talking about what's the problem with the tax structure that puts us in this kind of predicament anyway? And, you know, sooner or later, we've got to have that conversation around what should the tax structure really be doing in terms of supporting communities and the infrastructure needs of communities.
You know, you mentioned something about where these monies are going. Are these monies going to increase funds to education, or to simply backfill some of what's already been cut?
In the very first year, what it's going to be doing is backfilling. But over say the first 5 years, you're going to see an increase to the Prop 98 guarantee that could approach $15 billion.
Could you explain the Prop 98 guarantee to our viewers?
Prop 98 basically gives about 40% of the general fund to public education, and that is the money that's been decreasing over like I said, the last 4 years. We've lost $20 billion to that guarantee. So what this initiative does in the short term, in the initial years, is to start backfilling and paying that back. But as it gets to the final years of this, is actually building that guarantee and putting more money into public education.
It seems, though, that education is squarely in the crosshairs with Prop 30. If Prop 30 doesn't pass, 90% of the $6 billion trigger cuts are going to happen to education. Is it fair that education is being held hostage here?
Education's been held hostage by the state of California probably for the last 10 or 15 years. I mean, we don't have nearly the resources necessary to get done everything that we're being asked to do. And I think it underscores the courage and determination and resiliency of the people working in the classrooms today. Think about it. We need more resources. Parents know this. They walk into a public school, they see classrooms that are class sizes that are increasing. They're losing resources. Electives are gone. Where are the art and music classes? I mean, people understand that we're severely underfunded, and we have been held hostage, and it's about time we start turning that around.
Prop 30 also has this little-known provision, I think, in it that most people aren't aware of, that it guarantees funding for local public safety services as a result of realignment. And realignment is where they basically took convicts from state prison and moved them to the county jails. Now, the question is, that money then will be excluded from the pot used to calculate the Prop 98 guarantee. So this is a little bit wonkish, but does that mean that there's going to be less money for education?
I think what it means is that we're finally realizing that if we want to solve the problem, the California problems, the budget, the deficit, everything, we've got to come together. But public education sits in communities, and kids don't live at school. Kids live in communities. So the fact that some of this money is going to support the infrastructure needs of communities, we think that's a good thing.
Okay, well, in about 15 seconds or less, I'm going to let you summarize why should people vote for Prop 30?
I think Prop 30 really speaks to the issue that we've got problems in Sacramento. We've got to be accountable to the money that we bring in, and we got to pay attention to being sensible about the way we spend it. Minimal increase in taxes and huge benefit in the short term.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dean Vogel from the California Teachers Association. Up next, we'll hear from someone who opposes Prop 30. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. John Kabateck is with the National Federation of Independent Businesses and opposes Prop 30. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Great to be back. Thank you.
Well, why should voters reject Prop 30?
Well, right now what we're hearing from small business owners that we represent and voters in general is two things. They're very frustrated, frankly, with what their politicians are doing in Sacramento, and they're uncertain about what tomorrow will bring. But we're really hearing from small business owners about how frustrated they are with elected officials who are spending their hard-earned tax dollars recklessly in Sacramento. What we are seeing is actually, just a frustration. So Proposition 30 just makes a terrible situation for struggling Californians that much worse. It's a $50 billion, billion with a B, $billion tax increase on Californians. It has not a shred of reform, and it actually does nothing to help our schools, not one thing to help our schools. Frankly, the voters aren't buying it, and frankly, we're seeing that with the numbers drop in the polls, and we're actually certain that they'll reject it in November.
No, I think the LA report said it was $6 billion. How do you get to $50 billion?
Well, that's over the period of the years that they aggregate that.
So
but
each
yes,
year,
it's about a $6 billion per year. But that is very challenged. I think voters aren't buying it. They really don't trust where Sacramento is with their tax dollars, and we think they'll reject it in November.
Okay, so lawmakers are going to say on the other side, listen, over the last few years, we've made cuts to welfare to work programs, we've eliminated health care programs for children, we've cut funding for community colleges and universities, and we produced pension reform that will ultimately save tens of billions of dollars. So they would argue, hey, that's a lot of cutting. It's time to balance that cutting with some revenue, particularly on those making more than $250,000 a year to help close the gap. So what would you say to those who argue that we need a balanced approach to cutting spending and raising revenue to address the state's fiscal problems?
Well, we would say, given the scenario in Sacramento, that's absolutely nonsense. Spending already is up $5 billion this year and is the highest level it's been in California history. We need politicians to be better prioritizing what they're doing with money. If they were, they wouldn't be prioritizing pensions, high-speed rail, legislative pay raises, and other things over schools. But that's what they're doing. This is just a deceptive way to get more money out of taxpayers' pockets to fund their pet projects.
You know, one of the arguments is that on the pro-Prop 30 side is, hey, this is a temporary tax. It's not a permanent tax. We need this to get our fiscal house in order. So their argument is temporary. It's not permanent.
Well, we would say that funding any permanent expense with temporary revenues is exactly how we got into the mess we're in fiscally today. And this is exactly what the elected officials are doing, is looking to taxpayers, to small business owners, to foot the bill. So
would they be arguing, though, listen, we just got to get out of this financial ditch, and then when the economy gets better, we'll be okay? This is going to get us over the hump.
We hear that often, yes. But again, a temporary revenue to fund actual permanent programs is the wrong approach. And frankly, what we're saying is they need to prioritize their spending in Sacramento. And frankly, voters are very dubious about anything that's labeled temporary. So they're also very frustrated by that. So they're just saying, I'm not going to let go of one more dollar. And we're seeing that reflected in the polls.
You know, there's $6 million in supposedly immediate trigger cuts that are going to happen if Prop 30 doesn't pass. Can K through 14, because that would be not just K through 12, but also community college, take such a massive hit? And by the way, I guess UCs and Cal States are going to take another $250 million each, so another $500 million from those. That's a big hit to education.
Well, that would be great if it were accurate. But actually, according to even other studies, I mean, Mike Janess, the former director of the Department of Finance with California,
he was with Schwarzenegger, correct?
Correct. Recently did a study that showed actually that even if Proposition 30 does not pass in November, that we will have $1.2 billion more for schools if it doesn't even pass. So we're very concerned when they say that schools are going to be cut. Frankly, again, when we talk about K through 14, we talk about any of those types of things, higher ed as well. What our elected officials need to do better is prioritize their funding. If they really were serious and genuine about funding our schools and higher ed, we wouldn't see high-speed rail, much to the objection of voters. We wouldn't see them funding things like serious things like pensions that are out of control. And frankly, we wouldn't see money that was lost and that they're suddenly finding in California. It's just irresponsible the way they're doing things.
What about the LAO's prediction that if Prop 30 is rejected, state revenues would be billions of dollars lower in the future? And since education takes up the lion's share of the state's budget, doesn't that mean significant future cuts if Prop 30 fails?
Well, even the LAO has actually said that Proposition 30 goes straight to the general fund, so the schools don't really even see that. So it's really disingenuous for the governor and others to really hold schools hostage or to tell Californians that the schools will be held hostage and not get funding, when even the LAO has noted that this is funding that would go to the general fund. And again, we're seeing studies also. The Pepperdine did a study recently that showed more than 50% of taxpayer dollars don't even make it to the classroom. Voters should be outraged by that.
Two quick questions I want to get in. One was, do you think they're going to pull that $6 billion trigger? Do you believe it?
We don't.
Okay.
We don't. We've seen this threat before. The governor and proponents are using these as threats to try and get that money. Again, trying to get taxpayers to put more money out. And again, we're not going to know where that goes. People are already frustrated about where that money is.
I do want to fit in this one last question, so I apologize for interrupting.
No, that's fine.
Prop 30 promises a guaranteed funding for realignment. Who pays for the cost of realignment if Prop 30 is rejected by the voters?
Well, if Prop 30 is rejected by the voters, certainly it looks like it will be in the legislature's hands, and then they're likely to pass that on to the locals. No, the locals probably won't be happy with that, but that's most likely what we're going to see happen. If it does pass, actually, we're going to see a temporary fix for something that is a long-term problem, and that's just wrong.
Okay, well, thank you very much for being here. Up next, those who support Prop 38, the competing measure to fund education. That conversation will return. This is the Maddy Report. Kocivar is president of the California PTA and a supporter of Prop 38, which raises income tax rates on a sliding scale for all Californians. and also guarantees funding for all local schools. Well, welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thank you.
Well, it's been 19 years since California voters passed a broad-based tax on themselves. Why do you think voters are going to approve Prop 38?
Well, voters tell us something that's pretty clear. They tell us they're willing to pay taxes if they know the money will go directly to every local public school. And that's exactly what Prop 38 does. It raises money, and the money goes to every local public school based on the number of kids that are at that school. And the money goes for things that people want to see in their schools: librarians, counselors, small class size, things that really help children succeed. So when voters know that this is what they're going to vote for, it's something they'll support.
And how does that differ from Prop 30?
This very clearly spells out how the money is going to be spent. Under Prop 38, there's a very clear list of the items that the money can be used for. And so it can be used for things that we know will help our children succeed: smaller class size, art and music, counselors, librarians, more instructional time. These are things that people and parents have told us over and over again. They know these are things that will help children do better in school. And that's one of the reasons the PTA helped write this, because we want to make sure that we start to restore funding for our local schools.
Well, what do you say to the argument by the opponents in the voter guide that, quote, if you have a child entering the first grade, and I happen to, by the way, full disclosure, you'll be paying higher income taxes until that child graduates from high school, unquote?
Well, this is great for your child, because one of the things it's going to do is start to restore the things at every local school that we know are very, very important. One of the things about Proposition 38 is that it has a real sense of accountability. It tells you what the money is going to be used for. And if we're going to be asking people to vote to support our schools, we really believe that we need to tell them what it's going to be used for. And it's going to be used for the things that everyone agrees should be in our schools.
Well, let's get to that. Prop 38 creates something called a California Education Trust Fund that can only be used for limited purposes. What are those purposes?
Well, those purposes are the things that parents and communities know help children succeed: smaller class size, increased instructional time, help for youngsters with special needs, help for youngsters who are English language learners, providing counselors, providing librarians, providing art and music. It does things like provide money for professional development to help our teachers do a great job in our schools. It helps money to help parents help their kids be successful in schools. It has all of those ingredients that we need to start to improve how well our children do. And when we're 47th in the nation in funding for our schools, those are the things we have to start to restore to make sure our kids get a great education.
How would Prop 38 distribute those funds?
Well, it distributes those funds in a very, very clear formula. And the money goes directly to every local school based on the number of youngsters who are in that school. And I think a very important part of this is that the decisions on how that money is spent, those decisions are made by the local community, by the school district, with input from parents and community members and teachers. Those are not decisions that are made in Sacramento. Those are decisions that are made in our local communities, because our local communities know the needs of our local schools the best.
What would you say to those who say that this is just another example of ballot box budgeting?
Well, you know, one of the great things about Proposition 38 is it starts to restore the things we know are important for our schools. And it starts to restore, I guess, philosophically, the things that have been cut out of our schools. And as I've said, music, art, physical education, smaller class size, those are things that everyone agrees our schools need. And if you know what the money is spent for, that's a very, very important component of accountability. And we know that the money has to be spent at your local school based on the number of kids who are at that local school.
Well, let me ask this one last question. What would you say to the argument by some that Prop 38 really isn't necessary because the economy and tax receipts are going to be recovering?
Well, if you stepped into a California public school today, you'll realize that the statistic we're 47th in the nation in spending is absolutely real. We have cut back on so many things. We've decimated so many schools. One of the things that we have to do, and it's a real philosophical question that we as a state have to grapple with, do we remain at a new normal, which is way below the national average, or do we take this opportunity now to start to restore really the California dream of a quality education for every child in California?
Well, thank you very, very much for being here. Up next, we'll hear from someone who opposes Prop 38. That conversation when we return. This is the Maddy Report. Recently, we sat down with Allan Zaremberg, President and CEO of the California Chamber of Commerce, to ask him what is the chief reason why his organization opposes Prop 38.
Prop 38 imposes a substantial tax increase on all Californians. And it's not just temporary. It's for at least 12 years. It's virtually permanent under those circumstances. It's an over 20% increase on most Californians. And, you know, we need to get out of this recession. This is not going to solve California's deficit. So what we have is a huge tax increase on Californians, and at the same time we still have a huge deficit, which creates more pressure for additional tax increases. So, you know, we're in a situation where we have to look at this and say, you know, we need to take care of our deficit, we need to prioritize, we need to take care of the economy and get people back to work before we start looking at permanent tax increases that don't solve the deficit.
We also wondered what he thought about some of the specific provisions of Prop 38, such as prohibiting the legislature from diverting the money raised, restricting its use for increased salaries and pensions, mandating spending decisions at the local level, making school districts accountable for improvement each year, and dedicating funds collected above the growth rate to pay off the state debt. We wondered, did he think those were good ideas?
Well, there's no question that improving our quality of our schools should be a priority for everybody. But when we look at Prop 38, we see deficiencies here. We see deficiencies because local school districts don't get the tools to really reform the education system. They don't get the tools to make sure they have the best quality teachers in the best and most necessary locations. You know, when you bypass the legislature, I certainly appreciate what the proponents are trying to do here, and take the legislature, which isn't very popular in created deficits, out of the equation. But the legislature controls over 40% of the general fund budget for K-12 education. And to say that this is going to solve all the problems by taking it away from the legislature, when they can raise pensions, when they can raise benefits, when they can deal with the funding issues, just is a disconnect that doesn't necessarily go to solving the problems.
While the California Chamber is opposed to Prop 38, it's remained neutral on Prop 30. We asked Mr. Zaremberg how the public should read that. Is there some message here?
Proposition 30 is the governor's proposal to solve the deficit through an additional income tax increase and sales tax increase. It's for basically half the period of time that Prop 38 imposes the new taxes. We have members who are on both sides of the issue because the governor's goes towards solving the deficit, whereas Proposition 38 doesn't do anything to solve the state's deficit and continues to put pressure for additional tax increases on the consumers, on taxpayers in California. Proposition 30, we have people who care about higher education, who care about funding the court system, who care about solving the deficit. But we also have people who are just as concerned about the temporary tax increases that will be a drain on the economy. So we weren't able to achieve a consensus, but we did achieve a consensus on opposing Proposition 38 that imposes virtually a permanent tax increase, doesn't solve the deficit, and creates additional pressure for additional taxes to solve the deficits in California.
One of the arguments in the voter guide is that California schools perform poorly, that 24% of California students don't graduate from high school. Proponents counter that's because there have been $20 billion in school cuts since 2008, and the fact that California now ranks 47th in per-pupil spending. In short, California schools need more money. We asked Mr. Zaremberg to respond.
Just throwing money after a problem is not the only solution. We need to make sure that local school districts have the tools. when you get the resources. Now, let's go back to, we have Proposition 98 in California that was adopted in 1990 that guaranteed 40% of California's general fund budget towards schools. We have seen a decline in our school performance ever since that. We have seen a decrease in those who graduate ever since that. We need to be able to give local school districts the tools to be able to do a better job, put the right teachers in the right places, get rid of the bad teachers, make sure that the teachers have the tools, and I think that's most important, the tools and support of their principals, of the school boards to do their job, because they are on the front line of the education battle. And that's where we need to put our priorities. And when you look at additional resources, they need to be combined with reforms that Prop 38 doesn't have, that gives local school district the tools. Just to say we're going to hold them accountable without giving them the appropriate tools to get there doesn't solve the problem.
I want to thank Dean Vogel, President of the California Teachers Association, John Kabateck, California Executive Director of the NFIB, Carol Kocivar, President of the California State PTA, and Allan Zaremberg, President and CEO of the California Chamber of Commerce, for joining us. If you want to stay up to date with local and state politics, you can sign up for our award-winning e-newsletter, The Maddy Daily, by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.org. And now, another perspective.
Governor Jerry Brown's tax proposal is terrible public policy, but it offers the only plausible path to rescuing California schools from more painful budget slashing. Politics is the art of the possible, and Brown's Prop 30 is a political work of art crafted to meet the voters' approval. Prop 30 is lousy policy because it moves in the opposite direction of badly needed tax reform in Sacramento. It would make the state's roller coaster tax system even more volatile and unstable. Under Brown's Soak the Rich plan, California would become even more dependent on the wealthy and their unreliable topsy-turvy capital gains. There's another reason why Prop 30 is bad policy. It especially socks small businesses, which tend to pay the personal income tax rather than the corporate tax. But what makes Prop 30 politically plausible is that the vast majority of voters would not pay the higher income tax rates. They'd only be paying a token quarter-cent sales tax increase. Polls reflect the political wisdom of this strategy. Prop 30 is being supported by a slight majority of voters. Meantime, Prop 38, a rival measure by civil rights attorney Molly Munger, is trailing badly in the polls for the simple reason that it would boost income taxes for everyone except the very poorest. That's better public policy, but it's losing politics. The compelling reason to support Brown's proposal is a negative. If it fails, $6 billion in state spending cuts automatically will be triggered. Not just any spending cuts, but $5.4 billion for K-12 schools and community colleges, plus $250 million each for the two university systems. That K-12 whacking is the equivalent of chopping 3 weeks off the school year. At the universities, student tuitions would soar again. Munger's measure couldn't prevent the trigger cuts even if it did prevail. That's because her tax hikes wouldn't take effect in time. In the abstract, Prop 30 is bad policy, but in the practicality of the moment, it's needed to protect California's desperate schools. There are plenty of reasons to vote against Prop 30. The bullet train extravagance, hidden parks money, Sacramento can't be trusted, the governor should have exercised more leadership and handled the problem himself in the legislature. Brown doesn't deserve to win Prop 30, neither does Sacramento, but the students do. They're the only ones who would actually be hurt if Prop 30 fails. I'm George Skelton of the Los Angeles Times for the Maddy Report.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the Maddy Institute, the California Channel, Casey, or Valley PBS. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions shared in the Maddy Report, visit our website at valleypbs.org/Maddy.
This has been the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.